So welcome to the Bureau of Justice Assistance Smart Policing Initiative webinar on new findings from our Smart Policing Initiative site. My name is Vivian Elliott. I am the co-director for training and technical assistance for the Smart Policing Initiative, and we are very happy that you have all joined us today for what we feel will be a very interesting discussion on research-based smart policing impacts from across our nation. This webinar is a one-in-a-series of webinars sponsored by the Bureau of Justice Assistance and coordinated by CNA, the Training and Technical Assistance Provider for SPI. To date, we have conducted over 40 webinars, all of which are available on our SPI website at www.smartpolicinginitiative.com, as well as our SPI YouTube channel. However, today we'll be focusing on new and important findings from the Smart Policing Initiative. Since 2009, BJA has funded 48 law enforcement agencies who have partnered with researchers to implement and test 59 different innovative approaches. As a result, you can imagine that we continue to build a very strong foundation of knowledge on promising practices and improving policing practices. Today, we are privileged to hear from 4 of our SPI sites that have recently completed their evaluation studies. These studies range from efforts to increase homicide clearances, reduce crime through problem solving and focused deterrence, integrate and institutionalize data and analysis throughout all levels of a police organization, as well as predict and reduce violent retaliatory disputes through problem solving. Each of our sites will provide us a brief overview of their Smart Policing Initiative and highlight major findings and lessons learned from their work. Our presenters include Lieutenant Darren Greeley and Ms. Desiree DeSalt from our Boston SPI site, former Commissioner Robert Haas and Dr. Julie Snowbridge Davis from our Cambridge SPI site, Deputy Chief Dennis Cotto and Dr. Craig Uchida from our Los Angeles SPI site, and finally, from our Rochester SPI site, Mr. Nick Petiti and Dr. John Clofus. Our webinars on SPI findings are among what we think some of the most popular webinars. Thus, we're very confident today you'll hear something very interesting and learn something new. Before I conclude with some administrative comments, we'd like to give a special thanks out to BJA and our Senior Policy Advisor, Kate McNamee, for their longstanding support of smart policing. And I'd also like to thank the staff from CNA, Zoe Thurkelson, Chip Coldren, and a number of others who have put a lot of effort into this webinar for us. Finally, a few more logistical comments regarding our webinar, and then I'll hand it over to our Boston site to proceed with our presentations. First, so you are aware, the webinar is being recorded for the benefit of others who may view it later on our SPI website. We will have it posted online along with the slide presentations and recommended resources within the coming week. Upon joining the webinar, you are automatically placed on mute. We kindly ask that you keep your phones on mute while each presenter is speaking, and also not place your phone on hold. At the end of the presentation, there will be an opportunity for questions and comments. At that moment, we very strongly encourage you to speak up, ask any questions when that opportunity presents itself. You can unmute your phones at that time by pressing #6, and to mute your phones, you can press *6. Additionally, you'll see that in the webinar software, there's a chat capability on the right-hand side of your computer screen. Here you can share comments or questions with the presenters and others throughout the webinar. We will monitor those to facilitate responses to your questions at the conclusion of the presentation. And lastly, immediately following the webinar, you'll receive a request to provide some feedback. We request that you please spend a few moments to fill that form out, give us your honest thoughts and recommendations. And with that, thank you for joining us again today, and we will turn it over to our Boston SPI site to begin our presentation.
Hi, this is Desiree DeSalt. I am the Deputy Chief of Staff at Boston Police, and during the duration of this project, I was the project manager or coordinator of the Homicide Initiative. And I'm here with Lieutenant Detective Greeley, who's the commander of the Homicide Unit. He also was, during the duration of this program, was a commander of the Crime Scene Response Unit as well. So we've both been in it for the long haul. The goal of the Homicide Initiative was to increase clearance rates.
Okay, this is Darren Greeley talking. So we were looking at years where 2007 and 2011 homicide rate in Boston was roughly 44%, while the national average was around 65%. So obviously we were lower than the national average, and we wanted to increase our clearance rates. Our homicides in 2011, we had roughly 304. Majority of them were gang-related homicides. We only cleared about 28%. The next were drug robberies. We had about 48 of them, only cleared about 44%. Arguments, disputes, 63. We cleared 73% of those. Robberies, we had 14, cleared 57% of those. And domestic violence, we cleared basically 90% of those with 2 open, and that's probably because it was warrants for their arrest. And the other were 3 just other homicides. So we wanted to increase our clearance rate. So we used a FARO model of scanning, analysis, response assessment, low problem-oriented model. The scanning part of it, we had our Homicide Advisory Committee comprised of all of our Homicide Unit, Crime Scene Response, our other forensic groups, Crime Lab, Latent Prints, Firearms Analysis, as well as district personnel, members of the District Attorney's Office.
In this group, we met frequently with the opportunity to map out the current investigative process within the department, as well as find areas of improvement, as well as expertise, you know, what was being done well when everyone responded to scenes and areas that could be improved. We also reviewed investigative practices, best practices nationally and internationally during this time period. We had a UK consultant who works with the Boston site to look at the UK business model of homicide investigations. This model included a lot of documentation, resources were abundant, and personnel was delineated more about in each investigation. So this UK consultant also sat on the Homicide Advisory Committee when he was available and provided us with different manuals and different procedures that we could follow. We also did a scan of U.S. cities with high clearance rates and reviewed their manuals as well as on-call questionnaires and surveys to see what they were doing differently than what we were doing here in Boston. And then lastly, we looked at literature reviews on homicide clearances. There's not a ton of information out there, so we were able to look at different processes that people used in order to just determine impact on clearances historically, and then use that to shape our evaluation model.
On the response part of it, a lot of things we did within the unit itself. We number one, which was key, is we added additional detectives. In each squad, normally a squad had 1 and 2. We upped it to 1 and 3. Historically, we've always roughly had between 16 and 20 detectives, going back 10, 15 years ago. Now we have 40 detectives. And then we added also, we have a 15-person fugitive unit that helps track down witnesses, suspects, et cetera. It really helps when we have to get capious warrants or witnesses that don't want to come to court. So adding personnel was huge. We also standardized our investigative procedures by adding checklists, and that's from the officers on scene, a scribe, log, the patrol supervisors on scene with the jobs, the functions they do, as well as our district personnel. And then our homicide unit has a checklist, just procedurally what to do when you're at a scene, just formalizing what you already have in your head but putting in pen to paper. Also, this is really helpful across the board in every crime category, but particularly homicides, is standardizing our forensic review meetings. We collect a lot more evidence, forensic evidence at crime scenes, and we have our labs come and we meet with all our lab, latents, firearms, as well as the detectives and the prosecutors, and we go over what evidence was collected and what we want analyzed. We also provide additional training. Training is the key to everything we do. We had shooting reconstruction. We had baseline training for all homicide detectives on interview interrogation. You name it. We had across the board crime scene response training, just knowing what to see, how to analyze, and what we want to analyze, but interview interrogation was a big part of that. Again, we added a dedicated crime analyst, which really helps us free up time to do other tasks. The analyst will research a lot of the gang problems we're having, or suspects, witnesses, track down just a lot of the bio data for them. Like I said, training and new protocols for not only detectives but officers and handling crime scenes. And regular review of our homicide investigations. I always have weekly meetings with our homicide supervisors, a day out, 2 days out, 3 days out, and then I have monthly reviews of cases that are in the grand jury or in the investigative phase, so what we need to do, a to-do list. And then some of the equipment we purchased too is a FARO 3D laser scanner. We purchased a few of those for the crime scene response unit. It also helps, we did Shooting Reconstruction class, brought in the Hague group from New Mexico. We've already used them in some cases as well. And then we went into the evaluation design. I'll let Desiree talk about that.
So throughout all these intervention changes and different resources being added and trainings being conducted, we conducted a impact and process evaluation. So this intervention started in 2012 and then continued to strengthen throughout the year. And then the intervention period that we analyzed was between 2012 and 2014 compared to 2007 through 2011. These analyses included a simple comparison of clearance rates over that time period, as well as changes in investigative activity. Some of the changes that we saw during this time period was an increase in response personnel, an increase of witnesses at the scene interviewed, witnesses interviewed afterwards as well, evidence collected, evidence analyzed, and crime scene forensic group responding to the scene. So then we also looked at, well, this Anthony Braga is our research partner on this, and he did a statistical model on a regression model looking at the different criteria within homicide cases in Boston, which included the seasonality, neighborhoods, different case characteristics, and many more different aspects. So during this time period, we looked at it, we were able to determine that homicides can be impacted and that, do you want to do the findings?
Sure, the findings, the assessment. For the BP homicide unit, we increased our yearly clearance rate by 10%. What's different about Massachusetts compared to other states in the country is we work for the district attorney's office, and by state law in Massachusetts, the district attorney's office in each county are charged with investigating the homicides. So all the we cannot charge someone for murder. The district attorney decides when to charge for murder. We work for the DA. So that was some of the things different than Massachusetts, that we just can't go, say, all right, we have enough probable cause, we're going to go get an arrest warrant and arrest this person. We have to go through the grand, 95% of our cases go through the grand jury process, locking up witnesses' testimony, and it's run through the DA's office, and they decide when to charge. So when we looked at all the cases we have in the grand jury, a lot of the cases take time with all the testing we have to do. When we looked at cases that are already in the grand jury that we know we're going to get indictments based on the case that we're presenting, when we apply that model, our clearances increased by 18%. So the improvement in Boston's homicide was not observed in the rest of Massachusetts or nationally. This advanced statistical analysis showed that the intervention was associated with statistically significant increase in the probability of the clearance. So when we used all that regression analysis with all the tools we used, it showed that our clearance rate was dramatically higher. And we're still seeing that to this day. They've gone up higher and higher each year.
So in conclusion, our lessons learned has been that homicide clearances can be improved based off of research or based off of resources and personnel and training and the different intervention pieces that we used. That investigative effort matters, and that problem-oriented policing can have an impact. We also included a spotlight report. I think it should be coming out in the next couple of days through SPI, which explains a little bit more of our process and the research element of the Boston Homicide Initiative.
Thank you very much, Lieutenant Greeley and Desiree. It was great to hear about your Boston Homicide project. So let's turn it over to our next presenters, Commissioner Haas and Dr. Julie Schrober-Davis from our Cambridge site.
Hi, this is Julie Snowbright-Davis. I'm here with retired Commissioner Robert Haas from the Cambridge Police Department. We did kind of a unique project in that it was the only cross-jurisdictional, multi-jurisdictional SPI site. So there were 3 police departments that were involved in our project. Commissioner, if you wanted to take it from there.
Sure. So what we did is we partnered with 3 city jurisdictions just outside of Boston: Cambridge, Somerville, and Everett. And what we were looking at, quite honestly, was trying to figure out how we could effectively deal with high-risk offenders, and also understanding that we shared a number of our offenders cross-border. Either they lived in one jurisdiction and committed crimes in another, or did both, but we were actually seeing some commonality between all 3 jurisdictions, so we really thought it was an important partnership in terms of trying to bring jurisdictions together to work together. Our goals, besides building that collaboration between the 3 jurisdictions, was also to enhance our analytical capabilities. We had varying different capabilities within each of the departments. I would say Cambridge had probably the most sophisticated, since we've been doing it for 30 to 35 years. Somerville and Everett, Somerville had 1 analyst, and Everett was using a half-time analyst. So we wanted to really build that capacity because we thought the data was so important, and using data to drive our decision-making was a critical aspect of this initiative. We also wanted to foster not only a collaborative between the 3 police departments where we were working together, but build our communities, both our community leaders, people who live in the community, and also our social service provider, and sharing those resources across the jurisdictions. As you can imagine, each of those jurisdictions had different resources, but we wanted to leverage the power of all those resources in terms of being able to provide an alternative pathway for folks that were finding themselves constantly getting involved with the police through arrests in all 3 jurisdictions. And then ultimately, and my desire, and anytime we get a grant, is to build our overall capacity. So when we go into a grant process like we do with smart policing, we come out much stronger and better in a different place with respect to the application of the grant.
And the Operation RAZOR actually stands for Regional Analytics for the Safety of Our Citizens. So the concept that we used was kind of a modified focus deterrence. So our Operation RAZOR, there's some differences, but we took some of the elements from focus deterrence concept and other projects that use that concept. We were cross-jurisdictional, which means we had the 3 jurisdictions involved, whereas most other focus deterrence projects only used a single jurisdiction community. And because we had 3 jurisdictions, we also had 3 district courts that were involved. Most other single jurisdictions had 1 district court that they also had to be involved with. We were also very data-driven. We used a regional approach in terms of our records management systems from all 3 jurisdictions, combined those, then developed an algorithm to determine the top offenders or top individuals that were causing the most social harm in all 3 of these jurisdictions, whereas most of the pulling levers projects only looked at violent crimes. Many of them were identified, and the individuals that were targeted were identified by officers instead of being data-driven. Our Operation RAZOR had limited leverage in terms of just because people were on our list didn't mean that they were under any kind of supervision, whether probation or parole or even pretrial. So we had limited leverage to pull them into our program, whereas most of the pulling levers and focus deterrence is based on having that leverage. So our program was unique in that we spent a lot of time with offenders or trying to help them in many different aspects, which we'll get to. We had a complete partnership with our service providers, whereas most of the other pulling levers, focus deterrence programs had separate messages from providers and from law enforcement. Ours was unique. That was a complete partnership between all of us. And last issue, the police really assisted with the service delivery and the case management. It wasn't just at the notification meeting, which a lot of the pulling levers typically had a big law enforcement presence at the notification meeting, and then were involved in a lot of the traditional enforcement efforts only, where we were involved in much of the service delivery and case management.
The other thing I just add before we move on to the next slide is that we spent a lot of time working with our 3 district court first justices. We worked with the defense bar, the public defender's office, and the DA's office in terms of making sure They understood what we were doing, how we were going about doing it, made sure there were no ethical or legal issues or barriers that we were trying to cross, since we were actually dealing, as Julie said, with offenders typically who did not have any post-release supervision and really were free citizens to move about the community, but we also knew we're accountable for a large proportion of social harm that was going on in our 3 cities.
This shows the database that we contrived. So there was the Cambridge Records Management System, Everett Records, and Somerville Records Management System. They're all different systems that we needed to then combine into a regional database that we can then use our algorithm on to determine which of these offenders committed crimes in all 3 of these jurisdictions and committed the most social harm in these 3 jurisdictions. And that provided us with our high-risk offender list. There were varying different factors that went into the algorithm, looking at someone's weight in terms of the severity of the crime, looking at whether the crime was a gang involvement, whether there was a firearm, whether there was assault on officers, and then also the time factor of when the last crime was committed, as well as their involvement in terms of offender, defendant, suspect, involved party, victim. So all of those had different weights that helped us determine our high-risk offender list.
So what was interesting about this algorithm that was developed, it was Lieutenant Dan Wagner from Cambridge Police Department and Chris Boos, who I think many people know from his reputation in the world of analytics, and also partnering with MIT. We were fortunate to have MIT work with us and used the capacity of MIT to help us think about what the algorithm looked like and build that algorithm so it had basically a lot of components in it in terms of weighting, while also being able to denigrate over time with respect to recency, keeping the database very dynamic. So it was always changing depending on activity that was going on in the database. It was never a stagnant database by any means. And so it was really a powerful tool that was built and tested many times before we started to implement the tool. We were, I don't want to say the word fortunate, but we had in Massachusetts the Annie Duke case, which is where thousands and thousands of cases were being challenged because we had an analyst in one of our labs that basically was found responsible for altering the outcomes of drug cases. So we used that population first as our test case just to make sure that the algorithm was working properly. And again, we really were relying on data and then verification by people who knew these folks to make sure that the list was being generated by the computers first and then being verified through human factor. So what was interesting, and I like these charts particularly, and every time I talk about this, I always go to these charts. And again, this is a chart that Dan Wagner had developed for us. But what we were looking at once we compiled all our data and looked at our offenders, that we realized that roughly 40% of our offenders that were being arrested for crimes, I said 20% of our offenders being arrested for crimes accounted for 40% of the crimes that we were actually had closed through arrest. But if you look, as Julie was talking about before, and you factor in all our involvement with those folks in terms of being associates or witnesses or victims, that number jumped up to closer, that 20% jumped up to 80% of the same folks. So they really were, when we talk about high-impact players, not just high impact from the standpoint of contributing to crimes and being arrested for crimes, but also in terms of all our other involvement with these folks. So they really had a high utilization, or there was a high utilization of the police, and we were finding that that population of folks were the ones who were accounting for a good number of the activity within the community. And we really believe that if we could effectively deal with these folks in a way that presented them an opportunity to get out of that vicious cycle of just getting arrested, coming back into the community, doing some more harm, and then getting rearrested again, that we could actually start to have a meaningful way of not just reducing our crime elements with these folks, but also getting them to live more productive lives. So a key to this, and as Julie kind of indicated when she did the comparison between our modified focus deterrence and the conventional focus deterrence, was really relying heavily on the data, as I said before, and then being able to validate that with our detectives, particularly a number of folks who had narcotics arrests. Our narcotics detectives were basically coming into the meetings, which were being held once a month, and they were being, we had roughly about 40 or 50 people showing up at these meetings, including the Sheriff's Department and folks from the Prosecutor's Office and various different stakeholders, and really going through the folks that we were looking at and focusing on and really kind of validating it to make sure, and also gathering additional intelligence that was associated with these folks, where they were they still in the area, were some of them incarcerated, so what was their current status in terms of moving forward. Once we did the approach in terms of figuring out who we were going to invite into the meetings, and I'm going to let Julie talk about that approach, along with Dr. Craig Uchida, who's also on the phone, but he was our other researcher on this project, and they were the ones that devised how we came about identifying who the participants were. We basically had what was called, we did a notification, which basically meant that we had a group of detectives that were assigned to each of the folks that were being identified to be brought into our community meetings. And it was their job to find these folks, contact these folks, present them with a letter basically indicating to them, A, we've identified you a high-risk offender, that you're causing a great deal of social harm in our community, and that we want to invite you into a meeting to see if we can provide you with an alternative pathway to get out of the lifestyle that you're in. But more importantly, also working with the offenders' families. And we found that to be really more powerful than anything else that we could do. As you can imagine, the initial contact with these folks was not the most pleasant. Oftentimes they were rebuffed, challenged, and oftentimes, because the police weren't there for any official reason other than to kind of talk to them, it took the detectives quite a bit of time to kind of break through that initial barrier to reach out to folks to get them to come to the meetings. Once they came into the meetings, there were a number of folks that were in the meetings. There were the 3 police chiefs from the community. All 3 of us were there to talk to the individual that did show up for the meeting and really kind of give them a message. We know they don't like the lifestyle they're living in. We know their family doesn't like the lifestyle they're living in. We don't find it useful to continue to engage you in a way that we wind up having harm done to the community, and then arresting you, and then have you go away and then come back. And what we want to do is offer you an alternative pathway. But we were also equally clear in our message, and again, we weren't the ones delivering it. It was also the prosecutor's office and folks from the social service providers that were delivering a message that we want to give you an alternative pathway where we can help you reintegrate back in the community. As you can imagine, a number of folks had challenges when they came back out, and we really believe when they did come back into the community, they wanted to change, but they found themselves going down that same pathway over and over again. So what was that alternative pathway? What did it look like? What kinds of services could they take advantage of, and what could we do to help them move in that direction? And as Julie indicated earlier, it wasn't just a matter of identifying them, bringing them in, and handing to a social service provider, but working in groups of teams. So our detectives were actually case managers working with social service provider, particularly social service worker, to try to identify who we wanted to select in. This was purely voluntary. As Julie indicated, there were no levers. There were no ways to coerce them into it, so they had to make a choice of which way they wanted to go. And if they chose to come in, then we would maintain ongoing contact with them and continue to work with them to try to help them in the ways that they wanted to do. We kept in contact with the participants if they were on post-release supervision, and officers actually were supporting one another across the jurisdictions, because you can imagine there's a small group of officers doing very different kind of work with respect to taking an alternative approach with the offenders we were working with. What was key to it was a social worker that we had working on as a case manager. So we had the grant help us bring a social worker on to work on the project full-time, and basically work in tandem with the detectives in terms of doing the home visits, doing the follow-up, and just staying in touch with the folks that wish to get the additional assistance. Those that chose to not take advantage of it were told that if we did encounter them, that they were going to get arrested again, and that we were going to kind of continue to kind of put the pressure on them as we move forward, because we're not going to allow them to continue to do that kind of social harm.
This slide here just shows the amount of time that the case management team provided on each cohort of offenders. We had notification meetings 3 times throughout the year, and a number of participants in each cohort. There's literally 25 in cohort 1, cohort 2, and cohort 3. And you can see by the graph that case management, administrative, and law enforcement all spend a great deal of time on cohort 1. That also showed in the statistical findings, too, that cohort 1 had the least amount of time, or the most amount of time to arraignment for the next crime. So it showed that the amount of time that the officers and the case management team altogether put towards those offenders could make a significant difference as well. We also did some qualitative findings as well. Sometimes it's helpful to verify what you're looking at in terms of statistics with some qualitative information. One of our chronic offenders was this individual was at the top of our list, and she had a lot of involvement prior to being in the program. She was homeless, staying in the street. There was a lot of arrests for larcenies, assault and batteries, assault and battery with dangerous weapon, breaking and entering, and she was not looking in to change her life around. The case management team was able to persuade the court to keep her in jail with an expedited trial and a sentence to prison. And this just shows the enforcement aspect of the project when people did not want to participate or did not want to change their behaviors. The second qualitative finding was just another offender. This individual was had again several arrests, domestics, assault and batteries, larceny. He and his wife both attended the notification meeting. They were really touched that the police and the service providers noticed them and wanted to do something to help them. So on the success side of the treatment, they wanted to better their lives. And the officers, as well as the social workers and service providers, helped both him and his wife live a sober life. There were no more arrests. They were both alcoholics before. He had not worked in over 30 years. They found him some employment. So again, another success story there. And then lastly, just some lessons learned from our project. It was a very complex project with three jurisdictions, 3 police departments, 3 different courts, multiple service providers in all the jurisdictions. And one of the things that we learned is organizational learning is important, that the police departments and agencies involved really needed to be able to change their way of thinking and be willing to try new strategies and tactics and rethink that based on feedback and adjust accordingly. Second was that this project could have increased the number of offenders that would have been involved if there was leverage. Again, showing in the graph, the case management team spent a great deal of time and effort with all of these participants, and particularly in the first cohort, trying to get to know them and have them participate in the program. If there was leverage, that amount of time spent could have been decreased. And again, there's a lot more research that needs to be done on this idea of social harm and the effectiveness of this type of strategy, possibly in one jurisdiction, if not in, again, in multiple jurisdictions.
So I think what was important was just kind of highlight some of the things that came out of it. Clearly, we now have 2 full-time social workers on staff as a result of this project. We've enhanced our crime analysis by bringing another analyst in. Somerville basically was able to move to 2 additional analysts and actually went to a full-time analyst. We have a different kind of buy-in from some of our detectives. In fact, part of the job description in terms of detectives coming into the unit is understanding that they have this case management role when they come into it. Working with the service providers was kind of interesting because we didn't have any funding to support them, and yet they, through the 3 years that we were involved with this in the call meetings, they religiously showed up at the meetings and came to the meetings on an ongoing basis. We have much stronger partnerships between the 3 jurisdictions, not just the police departments and the courts and the court system, but also the community service providers that would now leverage across jurisdictions in terms of supporting when they're looking to move forward. And then finally, building that kind of relationship between the offenders and officers is very different in terms of this. It's a notion of procedural justice and really looking at how that's changed over time in terms of the relationship between offenders and officers.
Wonderful. Thank you, Julie, and thank you, Commissioner Haas, for that overview on the Cambridge SPI. Continue with our next presentation from the Los Angeles SPI with Deputy Chief Cotto and Dr. Craig Uchida.
Hi, everyone. This is Craig Uchida. I'm here with Deputy Chief Cotto. We're going to be talking about Operation Laser, and primarily we will talk about what went on and what happened, but we are also primarily interested in talking about how we've institutionalized Operation Laser in the Los Angeles Police Department. So what I'll briefly do is talk about what Laser is, why LAPD adopted the approach, give you some findings and give you a description of what's been done, and then we're going to talk about what it takes to sustain and institutionalize data-driven policing. So we call laser because we wanted to look at using non-invasive techniques to rid specific areas of crime and criminals. LASER stands for Los Angeles' Strategic Extraction and Restoration Program. And the acronym really was developed in 2010, 2011, when the captain in Newton Division said to me that he did not want to do the task force types of activities that the LAPD was known for in the 80s and 90s. And that meant really saturating an area with 1,000 officers to rid the community of a gang problem. And they did this quite a bit in the 90s. But he wanted to avoid that. He wanted to get in neighborhoods and really pick out who they should be targeting and also what types of crimes and where they should be targeting. We also wanted to use appropriate data and analysis to drive decision-making, and that continues from 2011 on. We also wanted to measure what matters, and measuring what matters, while it's a nice catchphrase, it really means not only looking at arrests and things of that nature, but looking at crime reduction and looking at what it takes to reduce crime and prevent crime, and measuring those effects. We use things like dosage, so we measure time. We measure how much time is spent in laser zones and how much time patrol officers spend in those places to reduce crime. We also focus on results and outcomes, and I think that's a real critical piece, because the outcomes of crime reduction are what captains and command staff are now looking at and looking for. Finally, here in LA, the LAPD was under a consent decree for about 11 years. And during that time, a lot of changes have taken place. And among those are the focus on constitutional policing, on making sure that officers understand search and seizure, understand privacy, understand the rights of citizens in the community. And so continuing to follow that is also very important. So those are the basics for what we're doing, and the foundation for what it's about. Let me briefly talk about what we did with the evaluation and how that helped institutionalize and help sustain what's going on now. As I mentioned, this began in Newton Division, in one division of 21 in the LAPD. Newton is also known for gang activity. It's a small area, 9 square miles, with about 200,000 people living in this area. There are about 44 gangs that are active here, both Hispanic and African American. What we did through focusing on specific locations and chronic offenders was to reduce violent crime that existed there. In Newton, from 2011 to 2012, we were able to reduce homicides by 56%, which means that they dropped from 39 to 16 from 2010 to 2012, and that continues, frankly. In that same year, violent crime decreased by 19%, and this was a startling thing for Newton because of its reputation as a very violent area. Newton was known as Shooting Newton, and I rarely use that phrase anymore because it was one of the things that we wanted to get rid of, and frankly, we have in that division. Newton continues to show positive results, and so because of that, this year and last year, the department decided to expand laser to 12 divisions of the 21 in the city. Okay, so I'm going to turn this over to Deputy Chief Cotto.
Yeah, good afternoon, everybody. One of the questions on that last slide was why expand, and it is because it works. And why adopt the approach? What we found when we watched Newton and the dramatic results that occurred there because of laser is it's effective because of a number of things, and let me kind of lay out the foundation. LA is a city of almost 4 million people now, and we are policed by a force of 10,000, 6,500 of which are in my patrol force. So relatively a small police force in regards to the size of the city and also the population. So using data and laser really helped us focus and put these officers in the right places at the right time, which made that us more effective in reducing crime. I think back in the 80s and 90s, crime was easier for officers, or criminals, gang members were easier for officers to identify and find. In this current urban environment, in this current place we find ourselves in LA, it's becoming more difficult because gang members have adopted the way they do their business. They no longer are flying colors. They're no longer gathering in large groups, and they are very much dispersed throughout the city. And I think as we become more urban with high rises and concentrated buildings, it's very difficult for our officers in the patrol force to really identify where these guys are hanging out and where is crime, where are the magnets for crime. So the data is now a tool which identifies those places where our officers should start beginning to look to identify why are we having this increase and why are we having this sustained crime in this area, and really decide or determine what it is that's driving that crime. I think nationally too, I think a lot of our patrol forces, especially here in LA, I have a very young patrol force. So our officers average probably 1 to 2 years out in patrol. It takes an officer probably around about 4 or 5 years to really understand their division and really learn where their crime hotspots are. What laser gave us the ability to do was really maturize my patrol officers in a very quicker fashion. They no longer had to wait and learn where the hotspots were. We were giving them where to go and who to look for and what they should be doing, and that really kind of sped up the ability for them to learn where to go as far as crime goes on. Some of the winning elements of laser is each of our divisions, the 12 that have been started now, have a crime and intelligence detail, which is staffed by officers and analysts that have the ability to take and analyze the crime, because our command officers that are running the divisions really are focused on other parts and maybe spend 2-3 hours a day looking at their crime, but these analysts are able to look at it for their whole entire day and really give the captains and our lieutenants and our watch commanders a better understanding of what's occurring based on the crime data that they're receiving. We identify hotspots and corridors. That's what the laser, what we would call mission areas. So each of our 12 divisions have, based on analytics and 10 years worth of data, corridors that have been traditionally their centers for crime. We identify those corridors and we ask officers to spend time in them and what we call laser zones, and we hold that for 9 to 12 months so we can really analyze whether our presence is actually deterring crime and are we effective. And I'll tell you this, some of our divisions actually saw an increase in crime last year, but when you looked at the laser zone within that division, the laser zone, although they did increase at a much slower rate than the surrounding communities right around the laser zones. So we know that putting officers there at the right time really had an effect on reducing the violent crime. Another winning element was the creating of the chronic offender. And I think when we listen to Cambridge, ours isn't as sophisticated or built out as much as defined as theirs is, but it is very effective for our officers to concentrate on those offenders we know are creating the crime in that laser zone and are responsible for a number of the crimes. So similar to Cambridge, we do go out and do notifications. We do go and make sure someone is touching them and talking to them, and we're trying to point them into the right directions. But we also, if there are shootings in that area or we see crime spiking, violent crime, those are the first people we go to and start looking at, to see if they were involved in that criminal activity. We do collect and analyze the data daily. We do constant conference calls with our captains so that we can make missions and put our officers into those specific places. I'm going to go a little quicker because we're spending a lot of time on that, but what we want to talk about is dosage. So when we first started laser, our officers were just spending time in those laser zones and just giving us a total recap of minutes spent in there, and which was effective. Just having officers in that zone made some progress in reducing the violent crime. But as we progressed through this, we learned that it had to be specific time, and dosage was even more effective. For instance, if our crime pattern was midnight to 6 in the morning, it did absolutely no good for officers. It had some effect, but for them to put time in at 10 o'clock in the morning or at noon. So our analysts have now gotten driven into a more specific time period for our officers to be in that laser zone. Our chronic offender bulletins are based on number of contacts that we have with individuals. We take points, and you'll see on the next slide, we use a point system to really identify who are we in contact with most often, who do we see on our crime reports more often, and based on that total of points is then our determination of who do we need to send letters to, who do we need to go visit, who do we track as far as arrests and whether they're being released currently or in the future so that we could monitor their activities once they are released. I'm sorry, I'm going to go through this pretty quickly now. But really the main issue is the sustainability of laser. Really it is Chief Beck's drive and his vision to eventually, by the year 2020, that all 21 of the divisions in LAPD, because we know it works, will have smart policing and will have laser as part of their strategies to reduce violent crime. It is part of his strategic plan. On our last slide, you'll see that LAPD has a plan to go to 2020 and increasing laser and smart policing each year until we reach that goal of all 21 stations is a part of that specific plan. Here's how we've been doing it. I'm a deputy chief of a bureau, so I have 5 of the 21 stations that report to me. So I have the ability to ensure that each of my command officers in those 5 stations adopt laser, adopt smart policing. And you'll find that all of the deputy chiefs, there's 4 of them that run the actual operational side of LAPD, are all committed to this program. We have all been part of laser since 2011. We have seen smart policing, the effects of it, and how it's been effective in our ability to control and reduce violent crime. And we have a very good relationship with our partners, Dr. Uchida, and our research partners. And we know that it's something that we have to go to in the future. It's something that we know is part of the makeup of LA and will make us a better police force as the city grows and as it becomes harder for us to root out the causes of this crime. The data-driven aspect of policing really is what we have determined to be the strategy that we're going to go forth with in 2020. And so even within our training groups, our younger officers, our lieutenants have now heard this concept since 2011, have really adopted it, and we see that in our Compstat process. It's embedded in our evaluation of their work. It's embedded, those questions come up as far as when we discuss crime, and again, from the top down, we've been pushing laser and smart policing.
One of the things I think that's also important is that, as Chief Cotto just mentioned, there are a lot of people that now understand it. The other thing that's happened is that a lot of captains, a lot of lieutenants are being promoted who get it and who use it. Deputy Chief Cotto was a commander about 4 months ago and oversaw a broad way of using data and using smart policing, and was recently promoted to deputy chief. Other captains, same thing has happened. They've been promoted to commander. Other commanders were made as deputy chiefs. So Bobby Arcos, who oversees Central Bureau. So it's those kinds of decisions that the chief has made and the command staff have made that have also sent messages to people in the department about how and in what way you'll succeed if you use a data-driven approach like laser and other things that we do here. There's a constancy, though, of evaluation that goes on. There's a constancy of training and retraining, of using the technology that exists, and all of those things in combination help push this along and help sustain the overall strategy and project. So that's it from us. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Deputy Chief Cotto and Dr. Uchida. It was wonderful to hear how you all have really embraced smart policing and laser in Los Angeles. We'll move on to our last presentation from our Rochester SPI site. We have Nick Petiti and Dr. John Kofitz. And just as a reminder, once we conclude with this last presentation, we'll open it up for question and answers. So if you have anything that you want to ask as a question, feel free to include that in the chat function. And with that, we'll turn it over to our Rochester site.
Hello, everybody. This is Nick Petiti. I'm the Director of Business Intelligence for the Rochester Police Department. Dr. John Klofitz, who is our collaborative partner on this SPI project out of the Center for Public Safety Initiatives at the Rochester Institute of Technology, he will not be joining us today. He's actually traveling for work, so you guys are stuck with me for the whole time. Just to give you a little background on our project, our SPI funding ran from roughly 2013 to mid last year, but we have since integrated the project principles into our daily operations. The idea is that we have kind of morphed this project into something that we do as a regular course of business rather than something we piloted in a certain location. Our project focused on our key department priority, which is addressing our violence problem. Just to provide a little context, Rochester, New York is upstate, located between Buffalo and Syracuse, and we have a fairly high level of violent crime, specifically firearm violent crime. In the last 5 years in New York, we have, on average, had the second highest homicide rate in the state, second highest firearm homicide in the state, and the highest shooting victim rate in the state. So we have a pretty complex firearm-related violence problem. And we thought to fully understand how complex our firearm violence problem is, that we needed to spend the first few months of our SPI project holding various focus groups with cross-sections of our entire law enforcement community. We conducted a number of incident reviews with all of our principal stakeholders, and we did a pretty expansive coding of all of our shooting cases from the previous 3 years, which at that time was 2010 to 2013. That accounted for about 600 shooting cases, so we have a pretty good cross-section of dispute-related issues that we can take a look at. The one constant theme that emerged in all of our shootings was that interpersonal disputes were central to a majority of them. In fact, our data and our analysis has shown really that locally in Rochester, over 60% of all of our shootings resulted from some known dispute. Now, that means basically someone, anyone. Sometimes it's the police, sometimes it's citizens, sometimes probation or parole, sometimes just family members. Even some cases, everybody knows that there's some sort of a dispute, beef, or argument or disagreement going on in a majority of our actual shootings. Now, I understand this might not sound like a major revelation, that people that are shooting each other have a pre-existing problem, but the big takeaway here is that if it's known prior to the event, then there is an opportunity that exists for intervention. So using that as our basis, our idea was to structure our organization in a way that worked around this concept. And it may sound easy, but most police departments aren't structured in a way to efficiently deal with focused dispute prevention. Most are organized in a way to quickly get to calls for service and to efficiently close out cases with arrest. Internally as a department, we found that we were really good at knowing enough about a current dispute to know where to look or where to go or who to investigate after a shooting occurred, but we weren't really organized in a way to prevent the next one. we were really efficient at going to get the guy. We would say things, an anecdote would be, you know, when so-and-so gets shot, we know where to go. We know where to go look next. And really, that was the mindset that we were trying to change. So in order to effectively address this problem, we decided we needed to change the way we thought, right? To stop looking at these violent events as individual cases that really only get closed with an arrest and then we move on, and really start to focus on disputes as our unit of analysis rather than individual casework. You know, arrests are great and may help solve the dispute, but they're not the primary goal now. Reducing the potential for further violence is what we're really focusing on with this project. So the key principles, they're pretty obvious. The best predictor of violence tonight is violence last night. So what we mean by that is really that we're looking at previous events and trying to get better at identifying them quicker, to start looking at assembling risk assessments to decide which cases we can prioritize and where we can actually go to take a look at intervening in a dispute rather than waiting for the next body to drop. And our feeling is the most effective way of reducing the shooting is early identification and intervention. It's getting in the middle of the dispute, especially the ones where there's a high risk of violence, in an effort to stop further violence. So operationally, we decided we needed to really define what we're talking about here. And I'm not going to read the slide. You guys can all read it to yourself. We found it really important to have a working definition. It helps us prioritize our efforts. I'm sure most of you are like us and you have limited resources. So it's really important to be diligent about identifying where you get your biggest return on investment. I mentioned before that we had a firearm violence problem. We average roughly 200 shooting victims per year. And if we know about 60% of them involve some sort of a known dispute, that would work out to roughly 120 disputes to address per year. Now, we don't have the kind of resources where we can actually do long-term active investigations on 120 disputes in a given year. So with our current workload, we decided that extra attention should be given to the ones that we can identify being the most likely for retaliatory violence. So our risk assessment becomes the crucial element in identifying those disputes. And we found that violent retaliatory disputes have the most risk of continuing, but also produce probably our largest opportunity for intervention. And I always like to think of it as a triangle. If you think of the base level of the triangle being all violence, and the next level up from the triangle being dispute-related violence, what we're really talking about when we talk about retaliatory violent disputes is the very tip of the triangle, the upper echelon of risk. And that's really what we're trying to get involved in, trying to get in the middle of, and trying to stop for future violence. So very simply, our project breaks down into basically 3 dispute intervention components and then 1 commitment. And really the commitment is to continually assess how our process is going so we can become more effective at our dispute intervention efforts, and really that we can get better at identifying disputes earlier, and that we can be more correct on assessing the risk of the violence moving forward. In addition to creating a couple new processes and procedures for sharing intelligence related to our disputes, we built 2 risk assessment tools that really guide us through the first 2 steps of our skeleton here. First, we built a field assessment tool, which we call Level 1. It's completed by a boss in the immediate aftermath of a violent incident. So in our case, most likely a shooting. It acts as both a checklist to assist in identifying the likelihood that the event is tied to a dispute, and then also an on-scene assessment of impending future violence. So the goal is that a sergeant, in this case, would be briefed on a scene when he gets to the scene, and then they would immediately start asking witnesses, and they would start conducting their regular investigative process with the idea that this could potentially be part of a larger dispute. And the goal of the Level 1 analysis is that the sergeant makes an assessment on any kind of immediate need in the aftermath of the shooting. So based on who we know the victim is, if we know him at the time, any suspects, do we need to make operational decisions immediately to avoid potential future violence? So we're not necessarily focusing 100% on solving that case right away, but more putting it in a larger context of, is it going to lead to more violence? Secondarily, we have a component that's completed, and a risk assessment that's completed by our dispute crime analyst, and that usually takes place within about 24 hours of a violent incident. It's a much more in-depth assessment of the event, the participants and their associates. It really builds on the initial field assessment that the sergeant does on scene, and it ultimately results in the dispute being assigned a risk score. The risk score will end up determining whether the dispute warrants moving to our third step, right, which is an intervention. It's not saying we won't do anything if it's not the highest level. It's just that we're going to dedicate these extra resources if it moves to what we would feel is a high risk for a violent retaliatory dispute. If the score indicates that there's a high likelihood for continued retaliatory violence, then our commander of special operations, who's assigned as kind of the operational manager of this project, he will assign a case manager, which is usually either an investigator or a captain. And captains manage all of our sections, which are like divisions or precincts in other organizations. And it will ultimately be their responsibility for tailoring a response plan to that specific dispute. The unique nature of disputes lends itself to having an individual response plan instead of having a cookie-cutter approach to kind of grabbing, okay, we have a dispute. This dispute is the same as the last dispute, which is the same as the one over here. Now, there's interchangeable parts, possibly in some of our interventions, that we could utilize in multiple disputes, but ideally, we would want to tailor a plan specifically to the people, the circumstances, and the known issues around that dispute. These plans and the progress of these plans and how we're actually implementing the process, they're reviewed at a weekly operations meeting, which is attended by all of our local law enforcement and a bunch of different community partners. The thing that's important here that we haven't really done a great job previously, prior to this project, on doing is documenting our procedural steps. So because we are now documenting everything we do in the process, we have the ability to go back and conduct after-action reports and take a look at what was successful in this dispute intervention and what wasn't, and if there's ways that we can modify that to potentially work better in the future. So constant assessment is really that fourth step in our process. Risk really becomes the most important thing for our dispute process, is really understanding which of our disputes are more likely to result in violent crime. And for this, we've categorized into 4 different categories. We really focus on the event, the participants, their associates, and then any kind of other mitigating factors. This is primarily the process that the crime analyst takes when they're assessing the risk level for the dispute. They're going to actually go through each one of these 10 variables and score them based on the participants in the dispute and what we know about the dispute. This is an evolving process. So as we go through the disputes that would end up qualifying for an intervention, we start to look at, is there any more intelligence that we've gained? Is there any other knowledge that we now understand that we didn't at the beginning, that we can then go and sharpen our assessment tool? So can we potentially score these things higher based on new information? This process goes through the analyst, it gets passed through the section captain, and it also goes through the commander of special operations. There's 3 different people that take a view at this and all score the dispute. And then the commander of operations makes an ultimate call on whether it is something we have the resources to intervene on, or if it would just follow the normal course of action that we would take for a singular investigative incident. Our thought process in using all of this is that it's a new way for us to organize that makes dispute identification both likely and interventions plausible. It's really a change from our traditional reactionary mindset and incorporates both tried and true police tactics. It's not something completely out of the box that we're trying that we can't possibly sustain. The real key here is to make the disputes the level of analysis. So when you're making resource allocation decisions, when you're looking at what types of interventions to utilize, whether you're going to do some community outreach or you're making budgetary choices, all of those must be weighed against the risk for future retaliatory violence instead of identifying individual case investigations. So in the better than 2.5 to 3 years that we've actually been implementing this program, there's a few key program issues that we've identified in our project. First and foremost is that specific, deliberate planning process is needed in order to institutionalize this. And you really need to rely on having a solid foundation in crime analysis. For us, we actually dedicated a full-time crime analyst to dealing solely with violent retaliatory disputes. That means she's constantly reviewing all of our violence packages that come in. She's assessing the level 1 assessments that come in from the field. She's looking for information on social media. She's looking for other potential disputes to then do her coding for her level 2. Then we're going to really focus on preventing immediate violence, and that's not only done through an arrest. If we can make an arrest and that stops the problem from reoccurring, then great. But the thing here is to not just say, okay, we made an arrest, let's move on to the next one. I think the thing that gets pretty difficult for police departments is to think a little bit beyond traditional enforcement. And that's kind of to broaden your toolbox, really, and develop interventions that target specific elements of the dispute. So you're really talking about having, beyond just investigative interventions, some crossover interventions and some direct prevention interventions. And then, you know, a key principle here ends up being learning from your experience. This is not going to be clean right out of the box. If you were going to commit to focusing on disputes as a unit of analysis, you've really got to do your homework because it's a change from what you were, well, at least from what we have normally been doing. You've got to have a willingness to sit down and review steps that you've taken, track your data, make sure you're keeping up on your process developments as you move forward. And then ultimately, this can't be something that it's one special unit or one special group in the police department. The idea here is that you're going to kind of identify and train these next generation of problem solvers to kind of look at these things differently than the way they've been taught throughout their years on the force, to respond to a call fast and only worry about making an arrest. So just to give you a little taste of where we've been as we've kind of gone through this, this is a time series. This is time series data for by month for our aggravated assault and murder counts. The green line represents full program implementation, which happened around October 15th. We originally started as a pilot in one quadrant of our city and then kind of expanded citywide. You can see that we didn't exactly experience a dramatic post-implementation drop that you may see in some other well-publicized, you know, law enforcement experiments. But I think what's key there is that we also haven't seen the gradual return to pre-implementation levels that usually follows some of those major drops that you see in some of those other experiments. Obviously, we've not found a silver bullet to cure our violence problem. We still have a fairly high level of violent crime. But we have been able to do, through a lot of hard work and, frankly, critical self-assessment, is make slow, incremental progress. And that's really a reflection of our knowledge base growing. We're getting faster at identifying violent disputes. We're getting more efficient at intervening in them through trial and error. And we've purposely taken a measured approach to build a process that we think is sustainable. Based on our early results, I think centering our strategies around disputes seems to be at least contributing to our desired outcome of reducing violent crime. I'm not going to say it's the only thing that we're doing, but it's a very significant portion of our approach to dealing with violent crime. And you can see that, you know, the monthly mean pre-program was 84 aggravated assaults and murders per month, and the monthly mean post-implementation is 73. So we have made some strides here. We have made a little bit of success. I can tell you anecdotally, from a process standpoint, we have gotten extremely efficient at identifying these disputes and tracking our interventions and following up from a focus standpoint to look at what is going on relative to the effort that we're making in these tailored plans. think that's all. Yeah, that was all I had on this one.
Wonderful. Thank you, Nick. We really appreciate that informative overview of the Rochester Smart Policing Initiative. So at this moment, let's open it up for questions from our audience for our presenters. As a reminder, you can submit questions into the chat box, or at this moment, if you would like to ask them via phone, feel free to press #6 to unmute your telephone. But let's go ahead and get started with some. I believe a few were submitted in the chat feature. Zoe, do you want to go ahead and tee a couple up?
Sure, Vivian. So the first question is specifically for Boston. The question is that in your scanning phase, you saw a big difference across the different types of homicides. Did you tailor your responses to the different types, and did the results vary across those different types?
Hi, this is Desiree. Our response didn't vary across the different types of homicides, but we did identify through a preliminary analysis just what cases were specifically more difficult for us to clear. So during the time period when we were collecting data, we were able to account for the types of factors that might impact those cases specifically.
Great, thanks, Desiree. Does anyone have any questions via the telephone? Okay, Zoe, any others from the chat function?
Yeah, I have one that could be for any of the sites to respond to. So the question is, what's one factor that most impacted your sustainability efforts in your initiative?
This is Chief Cotto from LAPD. One of the things in our department that's affecting the sustainability is really the cost of maintaining and creating operation centers and CIDs in each of our 21 areas. That's really what is slowing down some of this process. And another one is our department right now is having a number of people retiring in key positions. So there right now has been a lot of movement within our area. So another key to sustainability, like Dr. Uchida said, was the retraining of CID folks and officers in the analytic part of our process has also not slowed down, but it is something that we have to continue to revisit is as people move out of these positions in our areas that are in smart policing and in lasers, retraining and refocusing everybody on that same mission. So those are the two issues that we're seeing in LA that kind of drive or will give us an idea of how fast we could implement these changes and how slow we're going to have to do it.
So this is Bob Haas from Cambridge and Somerville and Everett. What we did when we went into the grant was actually wanted to use it as a capacity building, but also demonstrate the efficacy of doing this kind of work. And all three agencies not only are sustaining the program, but had gone through expansion in terms of additional analysts. In the case of Cambridge, social workers, and I know that Somerville pulled on a social worker as well because of the work we were doing. So we were able to demonstrate to our communities just the value in terms of taking this approach.
Thank you. Any other questions, Zoe?
Yeah, we just had another question come in via the chat. So this is for any of the sites. How well have your initiatives been embedded into the organizational and operational structure of your agency? Is this something that's not just seen as a special project, but now part of how your agency does business?
Hi, this is Desiree from Boston. Sorry, go ahead. So we've actually incorporated, we're in the process of incorporating many of the intervention procedures that we put forward as our rules and regulations. So a lot of the procedural elements and documentations that were created for the project are now being incorporated into standard response across all the units.
So just a quick anecdotal story. On one of the projects, or how the project grew, was actually into our narcotics unit. And narcotics detectives are a different, I don't know how to describe it, but they're different. And their role, quite honestly, up to this point in time prior to this project, was really looking at opioid addicts as potential confidential informants and methods to getting to buyers. That model has completely changed in our entire narcotics unit. They actually are now working with a social worker, and then when we have an overdose case, they're responding with the social worker, not to get information from the subjects, but actually to try to get them into treatment and start to get them on a path of recovery.
Great, thank you. Do we have any other questions from the audience? Okay, we're going to wrap up our discussion today with Dr. Chip Coldren. He's a co-director of the Smart Policing Initiative for Training and Technical Assistance. Chip?
Yes, Vivian. Thank you very much. I'm hoping everybody can hear me okay. I just want to make just a couple closing remarks, actually. And the first thing I want to say is it's very, very gratifying to watch agencies like Boston, Cambridge, Rochester, and LA, and actually other smart policing sites go through the process of developing and implementing a project, bringing it to a conclusion, actually demonstrating what I find to be very strong fidelity to the principles of smart policing. And so you can see some of them listed up here. And we know, as some of that work entails some very deep slogging through data and analysis and months of planning, and it really pays off. I just want to thank them for giving smart policing such a strong start and a strong effort, to see it through to the good results that they have. And it applies to more agencies than the 4 we've highlighted here, but it's very gratifying to see that. So I just want to make a couple points to highlight this kind of fidelity that I'm talking about. One of the things that we talk about an awful lot in smart policing is this notion of making better use of data and analytics to guide decision making. And as we've heard from several of our presenters, that also entails building that analysis capacity so you can actually do that work. So you can see through Boston's very in-depth, intense analysis of their homicide cases, Cambridge's emphasis on information sharing and the development of the algorithm, LA's use of intelligence data and their sophisticated integration of multiple data systems, Rochester's analysis of retaliatory violence. These are all examples of how these agencies worked in very close collaboration with their research partners to get the data, analyze the data, figure out what the data were telling them, and actually make some decisions based on that analysis. It's just kind of the heart of what we do in smart policing. It's also encouraging to see the types of innovation that our sites are coming up with. So I very much appreciated the focus in Cambridge on harm reduction. I think we see a similar thing in Rochester, as they said, on the focus on, disputes as the level of analysis. Those are, as Nick said, not the most outrageous innovations in the world, but there's certainly demonstrate new thinking and new ways of approaching things. I liked LA's crime intel details. I think that was an innovation for their organization that seems to have paid off in spades for them. So that's all encouraging. And we also see in these sites several different approaches to the design and analysis, and the outcome evaluations. So in Cambridge, you had an experimental design. Boston used some very sophisticated statistical modeling. Rochester used that time series analysis approach. And so each of those are, very valid scientific analytical approaches, and they demonstrate, at least for me, how important this research partnership is. in many cases, even with capacity building in the crime analysis units, this type of design and this type of analysis is not really possible without a strong research partner. So again, it's really it's a pleasure to see these sites unfold as they have and hear them present this information. I thank them, and I know Kate from BJA and others thank them very strenuously for the hard work and the effort that they've put in. So those are my remarks. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Chip. So that concludes our webinar today. Thank you, everyone, especially our presenters, for joining us today. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to us at SPI@CNA.org or to visit our Smart Policing Initiative website. And once again, we thank you, and we will be closing out the webinar now. Have a great day.